Welcome to Sci-Fi Scroll, your gateway to galaxies far, far away. If you're ready to explore epic adventures, futuristic worlds, and mind-bending tales brought to life, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up to stay tuned for all the sci-fi stories your imagination craves. Let's dive into the unknown. Chapter 2. Trouble in Transit. The stellar horizon hummed to life, its engines grumbling like a cantankerous old man being forced out of bed. The entire ship vibrated as it pushed off into open space, the thrusters coughing slightly before finally settling into their usual uneven rhythm. Ethan sat slouched in the pilot's chair, boots propped lazily on the console. His fingers drummed against the armrest, in time with the faint creaks and groans of the ship's aging frame. Through the cockpit's viewport, the stars stretched into brilliant streaks of light as they hit hyperspace, bathing the room in a kaleidoscope of shifting blues and silvers. For someone else, it might have been breathtaking. For Ethan, it was just Tuesday. Cruise control engaged, he muttered, to no one in particular, flipping a switch with the nonchalance of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. All systems nominal. Feel free to stretch your legs, folks. Or don't. Honestly, I don't care. The soft clang of boots against the metal floor made him glance over his shoulder, though he didn't bother turning all the way around. He didn't need to. There was only one person on board who walked like they were auditioning for a role as the galaxy's most regal statue. "Captain Drake," came Lirae Vash, silken voice, as smooth and unflappable as ever. "Do you always conduct your flights with such enthusiasm?" Ethan smirked, tilting his head lazily to glance at her. Sure enough, there she was, framed in the doorway like some kind of interstellar painting. Her shimmering Altheran skin caught the dim glow of the cockpit lighting, refracting it in subtle, shifting hues that made her look like she belonged in an art gallery instead of a dingy old freighter. As always, her posture was perfect, arms folded neatly across her chest, and her expression was neutral, but not so neutral that it hid the faint edge of disapproval in her tone. "Enthusiasm?" Ethan repeated, his grin widening. "That's a big word for competence, but I'll take the compliment." Lirae's lips pressed together, her expression shifting just enough to suggest she was debating whether or not to dignify his comment with a response. She didn't. Instead, she stepped fully into the cockpit, her movements precise and deliberate, like she was trying to avoid touching anything unnecessarily. She gestured to the co-pilot's chair. "May I?" "By all means," Ethan said, waving a hand grandly. "Make yourself at home. Just, don't touch anything. Wouldn't want you to accidentally eject yourself into hyperspace. That'd really kill the vibe in here." Lirae ignored his grin and lowered herself into the seat with the kind of grace that probably required years of practice, or maybe it just came naturally to her. "I've no intention of interfering with your process," she said, her tone polite but clipped. Ethan leaned back further, lacing his hands behind his head. "Good to know. It's a delicate process, Takes years of training to master the fine art of leaning back and letting the autopilot do the work. I'm sure the Interstellar Alliance will be thrilled to hear that their hand-picked pilot relies on autopilot," Lirae replied, her voice dry as desert air. Ethan barked out a laugh. "See? You've got jokes." I knew there was a sense of humor under all that diplomacy. "Humor is not a priority in my line of work," she said simply, her tone as cool as ever. "I prefer efficiency and focus." "Well, that explains why you've been glaring at me since we left the dock," Ethan quipped. "Relax, princess. This ship could fly itself to Vega with one engine tied behind its back. I've got it under control." "First," Lirae said, her voice sharpening slightly, "I am not a princess. Second, I would appreciate it if you refrained from referring to me as such. Third. She froze mid-sentence, her gaze narrowing slightly as something caught her attention. Ethan followed her line of sight to the small speaker mounted above the console, where the unmistakable opening chords of an old Earth rock song were playing. "What is that?" she asked, her tone hovering somewhere between curiosity and disapproval. "That," Ethan said, grinning, "is music. Specifically, Highway to the Stars by the Asteroids. Classic Earth rock. Good for the soul. You should try it sometime." Lirae tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "It's loud." "It's supposed to be," Ethan said. "That's how you know it's working." Lirae blinked, her face a perfect mask of composure. "I would prefer silence. I need to focus on reviewing my diplomatic materials." "Silence?" Ethan repeated, feigning shock. "What? No dramatic Altheran chants or ancient hymns to the cosmos? I thought you people were all about the spiritual stuff." Her gaze turned frosty, and Ethan swore he felt the temperature in the cockpit drop a degree. "We are about precision and purpose, Captain. Something you seem to lack." Ethan raised his hands in mock surrender. "Well, fine, Daddy-o. I'll turn it down. But only because I'm such a generous guy." He reached for the volume knob and turned it down a fraction. Barely. Music was still loud enough to rattle the overhead vents. Lirae took a slow, measured breath, the kind that suggested she was already regretting every interaction she'd had with him so far. "Thank you," she said, though it sounded more like an exercise in patience than genuine gratitude. "You're welcome," Ethan replied, flashing her another infuriating grin. "Anything else I can do for you, Princess? Fluff your chair. Adjust the lighting?" Lirae's gaze flicked to him, her expression as serene as ever. "Yes. You can refrain from speaking unless it is relevant to the mission." "Ouch," Ethan said, clutching his chest dramatically. "You wound me, Your Majesty." Lirae didn't bother responding. Instead, she turned her attention to the datapad she'd brought with her, scrolling through its contents with the kind of laser focus that made Ethan wonder if she was deliberately trying to ignore him, or if she was just that good at tuning him out. He settled back in his chair, tapping his fingers idly against the armrest as the music played on. "You know," he said after a moment, "you're gonna have to loosen up eventually. We've got a long trip ahead of us." "I assure you, Captain," Lirae said without looking up, "I am perfectly comfortable." Ethan smirked. "Yeah, I can tell. You're practically radiating joy." For the briefest moment, he thought he saw the corner of her mouth twitch, just a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of amusement. But it was gone so quickly, he couldn't be sure if it had been real or just wishful thinking. The cockpit fell into a comfortable silence, save for the steady hum of the engines and the faint strains of music still playing in the background. Ethan let his gaze drift back to the stars, streaking past the viewport, a small, satisfied grin tugging at his lips. An hour into the flight, the stellar horizon was cruising through a quiet stretch of space. The hum of the engines was steady, the kind of sound that could almost lull someone into a false sense of security. Most of the crew had retreated to their quarters or gathered in the common area, leaving Ethan alone in the cockpit. He leaned back in the pilot's chair, boots propped up on the console as he lazily spun a small wrench in his hand. The stars outside were calm, unchanging. "Smooth sailing," he muttered to himself. For once, he should have known better. Captain Lirai's voice crackled through the intercom, calm and clipped as always. "There's an anomaly on the long-range scanners. You may want to take a look." Ethan groaned, sitting up and tossing the wrench onto the console. "Of course there is," he muttered, pulling up the scanner readouts on the screen. When the display lit up, his frown deepened. A cluster of ominous red blips filled the screen. An asteroid field. A big one. The kind that gave insurance agents nightmares. Because, why not? Ethan grumbled, rubbing the back of his neck. Can't have one boring trip. Oh no, that would be too easy. He flipped on the ship-wide intercom, his tone casual despite the knot forming in his gut. Attention, crew, .A. We've got a bit of a bumpy road ahead. Strap in, hold on to something, and try not to scream too loud. It's distracting. He leaned back, watching the field grow larger on the viewport as the ship approached. The asteroids were already visible. Massive, jagged chunks of rock, tumbling through the void like drunk giants at a boulder-throwing contest. Before Ethan could even finish taking in the scene, Lirae appeared in the cockpit doorway, her expression calm but her presence radiating authority. She moved like she was gliding, her hands clasped neatly behind her back, but there was a faint tightness in her jaw that hadn't been there before. "What's the situation?" she asked, stepping forward. "Just a few rocks," Ethan said, gesturing at the viewport, like it was no big deal. "Nothing I can't handle." Lirae raised an eyebrow and moved closer to the co-pilot's chair, her shimmering Altheran skin catching the dim cockpit lights. She glanced at the scanner display, her neutral expression shifting ever so slightly as she took in the dense asteroid field ahead. "That looks substantial. Dal I antennae. No antideus devni ordia." Ethan shrugged, cracking his knuckles as his hands settled on the controls. "It's a little tight, sure, but I've done worse." "Relax, princess. This is what I do." Before Lirae could reply, the ship gave a subtle shudder as they crossed the threshold of the field. Asteroids, some as small as hovercars, and others the size of small moons, tumbled past at alarming speeds. Ethan's hands moved quickly, adjusting the thrusters and nudging the ship into a tighter trajectory. The cockpit's viewport filled with chaos, a swirling mess of debris, some pieces glowing faintly from past collisions or stray cosmic radiation. The stellar horizon weaved between them, its thrusters groaning under the strain of constant adjustments. Lirae gripped the back of the co-pilot's chair, her serene mask finally cracking. Her fingers dug into the metal frame as she steadied herself. "This is your idea of under control?" "Yup," Ethan said with a grin, though sweat was starting to bead on his forehead. His eyes darted between the viewport and the control panel, hands flying across switches and levers. "Relax, princess. I've done this 1,000,000 times. Easy as pie." The ship jolted violently as a smaller asteroid grazed the hull, sending a metallic screech through the cabin. Lirae's iridescent eyes flared, shifting to a sharp crimson that practically screamed alarm. "Ethan," she snapped, abandoning her usual formality. "Do you have any idea?" "Of course I do." Ethan shot back, his voice rising to match hers. His grip on the controls tightened as he banked the ship hard to avoid another massive chunk of spinning debris. "Now either sit down or shut up, because I'm trying to save your shiny diplomat ass." For a brief, tense moment, their voices echoed in the cockpit, overlapping with the groans of the ship and the faint crash of debris ricocheting off the hull. Lirae's composure cracked further as she glared at him, her crimson eyes practically daring him to say something else. Ethan, for his part, glared right back, his jaw set. He wasn't about to let her win this one, not when he was the one keeping them alive. The ship jolted again, this time harder, as another asteroid clipped the edge of the shields. Lirae stumbled, her hands flying out to catch herself on the console. Ethan saw it coming and couldn't resist. "Told you to sit down," he said, smirking despite the sweat dripping into his eyes. Lirae straightened, brushing an invisible speck of dust off her pristine sleeve. "Perhaps if you piloted with more precision, I wouldn't need to hold on for dear life." "Precision?" Ethan laughed, his hands dancing over the controls as he narrowly avoided another speeding rock. The ship banked hard to the left, throwing a loose wrench from the console onto the floor. You try threading a needle at 500 kilometers per second with a ship that leaks oil every time I sneeze. I was under the impression you were the best pilot available. Lirae shot back, her tone icy. And you're still alive, aren't you? Ethan countered, throwing her a quick grin. You're welcome, by the way. Lirae narrowed her eyes, her tone dropping to a low, dangerous register. You're insufferable. Yeah. But I'm good at my job, Ethan said, his grin widening as he pushed the ship into a sharp dive to avoid a particularly large asteroid. The stellar horizon groaned in protest, the sound reverberating through the cockpit like a wounded animal. Lirae opened her mouth to reply, but the ship lurched again, cutting her off. This time, she actually stumbled into the co-pilot's chair, grabbing the armrest to steady herself. Need a seatbelt, princess? Ethan teased, his tone light despite the tension in his shoulders. Perhaps you should focus less on your witty remarks and more on flying. Lirae snapped, her voice sharp. Ethan chuckled, his fingers flying over the controls as the ship slid through a narrow gap between two massive chunks of rock. Multitasking. It's one of my many talents. The cockpit fell into tense silence as the ship finally cleared the densest part of the field. The asteroids thinned out, the view beyond the viewport, opening up to reveal the calm, endless black of deep space. The stellar horizon shuddered one last time before settling back into its usual, uneven rhythm. Ethan let out a low whistle, leaning back in his seat and wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. See? Told you I had it under control. Lirae exhaled slowly, her crimson eyes fading back to their usual iridescent green. She glanced at him, her expression cooler than a glacier. If that was under control, I'd hate to see what chaos looks like. You'd love it, Ethan said, smirking as he swiveled his chair to face her. Chaos is where I shine. Lirae didn't dignify that with a response. Instead, she straightened her tunic and turned toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at him. Next time, try not to get us all killed, Captain, she said icily before sweeping out of the cockpit. Ethan grinned as he watched her go, then turned back to the console, muttering under his breath. She totally enjoyed that. The hum of the engines filled the silence once more, and Ethan couldn't help but chuckle as he kicked his feet back onto the console. When the stellar horizon finally emerged from the asteroid field, the entire ship seemed to exhale. The groaning of the hull softened, the vibrations in the floor evened out, and the stars outside the viewport stopped spinning like a chaotic blur. In the cockpit, there was a moment of silence. No alarms. No impact. Just the steady hum of the engines and the soft hiss of the air circulators. Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He swiped a hand across his forehead, wiping away the sweat that had gathered during the last 30 minutes of white-knuckle flying. See? No, he said, swiveling his chair halfway toward Lirae, who was still standing near the co-pilot station. Easy? Oh. In-law. Lirae's arms were crossed over her chest, her posture as rigid as ever. Her shimmering Altheran skin caught the faint glow of the control panels, but her expression was unreadable. No relief, no gratitude, just that same infuriating calm. That, she said evenly, was reckless. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That, he countered, pointing a finger at her, was necessary. You're welcome, by the way. Recklessness is not a virtue, Captain, she snapped, her voice sharper now. Her composure was still intact, but there was a definite edge to it. You could have destroyed the ship. You should have... Should have what? Ethan interrupted, spinning his chair fully around to face her. Waited for the rocks to politely move out of the way? Sent them a strongly worded diplomatic message? Sorry, Princess, but last I checked, negotiating with giant space debris wasn't in my job description. Lirae's jaw tightened, her iridescent eyes narrowing. You took unnecessary risks. And you're still alive, Ethan shot back, his voice rising slightly. So maybe, just maybe, you could try saying thank you instead of giving me a lecture. Before Lirae could respond, a timid voice cut through the tension like a knife. Hey. Both Ethan and Lirae turned to see Jensen, the youngest member of the crew, standing nervously in the doorway. He looked like he hadn't quite decided whether stepping into the cockpit was brave or stupid, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. Annie. Jensen cleared his throat, his eyes darting between the two of them. Thanks for getting us through that, Captain. I mean, you saved us. Ethan blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He wasn't used to gratitude, especially not from the crew. Sarcasm, sure. Mutters of annoyance, absolutely. Awe. But gratitude? That was new. Yeah, Ethan said after a beat, his tone softening slightly. He scratched the back of his neck, awkwardly avoiding Lirae's gaze. Sure. You? No problem, kid. Jensen gave a small, awkward smile, then quickly disappeared down the corridor, clearly eager to avoid getting caught in whatever argument was brewing between the captain and the diplomat. The silence that followed was almost worse than the asteroid field. Ethan leaned back in his chair again, spinning it halfway back toward the console. See? He muttered, breaking the quiet. At least someone appreciates me. Lirae's gaze didn't waver. If anything, the disapproval in her eyes seemed to deepen, like she was mentally cataloging every flaw in his decision-making process. You're welcome, Ethan added, this time muttering it more to himself than to her. You think this is a joke, Lirae said suddenly, her tone icy. Ethan stopped, spinning his chair. No, he said, his voice flat now. I think this is me doing my job. You want to talk about risks? Fine. Let's talk about how we'd all be floating in tiny pieces out there if I hadn't done exactly what I did. He gestured vaguely toward the viewport, where the asteroid field was now a distant memory. So, yeah, maybe I'm not efficient or precise or whatever other shiny word you want to use, but guess what? We're still here. Mission's still on. So forgive me if I don't feel like apologizing for keeping us alive. Lirae's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker, just a flicker, of something in her eyes. Maybe it was understanding. Maybe it was irritation. Maybe it was irritation. Either way, she didn't immediately fire back with another cutting remark, which Ethan took as a small victory. You are skilled, Captain, she said finally, her voice quieter than before. I will not deny that. But skill without discipline is a liability. Ethan chuckled, leaning back and lacing his hands behind his head. And here I thought you were going to compliment me for a second there. It was an observation, not a compliment, Lirae said sharply. Could have fooled me, Ethan said with a grin. Before Lirae could respond, a faint metallic screech echoed through the ship, a reminder of the asteroid that had clipped the hull during their daring escape. Ethan winced slightly, glancing at the control panel. Nothing major, he said, more to himself than anyone else. She's held together with duct tape and hope. She'll survive. Perhaps next time you might avoid damage altogether, Lirae said, her tone returning to its usual calm but condescending register. Sure thing, Princess, Ethan said, spinning his chair back toward the console. Next time we find ourselves in a death trap, I'll be sure to consult you first. Maybe you can negotiate with the rocks. I hear they're real reasonable. Lirae exhaled sharply through her nose, the closest she'd come to showing actual frustration. I'll be in my quarters, she said, turning on her heel and heading for the door. Don't forget to file a complaint with HFY. Ethan called after her, grinning as he flipped a few switches on the console. Lirae paused in the doorway, her back to him. For a moment, Ethan thought she was going to say something else, but instead, she simply straightened her shoulders and walked out without another word. The door hissed shut behind her, leaving Ethan alone in the cockpit once again. He let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. Discipline, he muttered, shaking his head. Who needs it? Still, as he leaned back in his chair and stared out at the stars, he couldn't shake the faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. She might have been infuriating, but at least she wasn't boring. Later that evening, Ethan was making his way down the dimly lit corridor toward his quarters, idly tapping his fingers against the bulkhead as he walked. The stellar horizon was quiet, save for the faint hum of the engines and the occasional creak of the ship settling into its rhythm. It was the kind of lull that usually put him at ease. But tonight, something made him stop mid-step. A sound drifted through the corridor, soft, melodic, and completely unexpected. Ethan froze, his ears straining to catch it. It wasn't the usual clanging of Tarek fixing something in the engine room, or Zara's off-key humming from the common area. No, this was something else entirely. It was singing. The voice was delicate, but steady, weaving a melody that seemed to float through the air like smoke. The words were in a language he didn't recognize, fluid and lilting, with a rhythm that felt almost otherworldly. The sound had a haunting quality to it, like starlight turned into music. Ethan took a cautious step forward, the faintest hint of curiosity tugging at him. The sound was coming from behind a door just ahead. Lirae's quarters, he realized. He hesitated. Hell, he knew he should just keep walking. The last thing he needed was another lecture about boundaries or professionalism, or whatever other nonsense Lirae liked to throw at him. But something about the song rooted him to the spot. He leaned slightly closer, just enough to catch more of the melody. The voice rose and fell, each note more mesmerizing than the last. For someone who seemed to have a permanent stick lodged somewhere unpleasant, Lirae sang like she was pouring her entire soul into it. Figures, Ethan thought, a small smirk tugging at his lips. Even her singing is annoyingly perfect. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, listening like some kind of space-born eavesdropper, but before he could stop himself, the door slid open with a soft hiss. Ethan nearly jumped out of his skin. Lirae was standing there, her expression calm, but holding that faintly amused glint he'd come to find both irritating and oddly entertaining. She was dressed casually, well as casually as someone like her could manage, with a long, flowing tunic that shimmered faintly in the dim light. For once, her usually perfect posture was slightly more relaxed, though her gaze was as sharp as ever. "Enjoying yourself, Captain?" she asked, one eyebrow arching just enough to make him feel like an idiot. Ethan cleared his throat, scrambling to recover. Just passing by," he said, gesturing vaguely down the corridor as if he had anywhere to be. "Didn't mean to. You know. Linger." Lirae offered, her lips twitching faintly. "Yeah, that," Ethan said, rubbing the back of his neck. Nice voice, by the way." Her head tilted slightly, a gesture he was starting to recognize as her version of curiosity. "You think so?" "Well, yeah," Ethan said, trying to sound casual. "I mean, it's not exactly my usual playlist, but it's good. Haunting. Kind of makes you feel like you're floating through a dream or something." Lirae's lips quirked just enough to suggest she might actually be amused. That's quite the compliment, coming from someone who considers Highway to the Stars a cultural masterpiece. Ethan blinked, momentarily thrown. Wait, was that a joke? I have no idea what you're talking about, Lirae said smoothly, though the faintest hint of a smile lingered on her lips. Ethan stared at her for a moment, trying to figure out if she was messing with him. Okay, you're definitely messing with me. Aren't you? Good night, Captain, Lirae said, ignoring his question entirely. She stepped back into her quarters, the door sliding shut with its usual soft hiss. Ethan stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door like it might offer some kind of explanation. Weird alien princess, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he turned and headed back toward his quarters. But despite himself, he couldn't quite shake the sound of her voice. It lingered in his mind, the melody replaying itself over and over as he walked. Even as he flopped onto his bunk and stared up at the ceiling, the song refused to leave him alone. Great, Ethan grumbled to himself, throwing an arm over his eyes. Now I'm stuck with her and her damn singing in my head. This trip just keeps getting better. But even as he tried to will the melody away, a small, grudging part of him had to admit, for someone who seemed to have a permanent stick up her perfectly polished backside, Lirae Vash could seriously sing.